The rain in this godforsaken Hürtgen Forest didn't fall. It seeped. It seeped out of the perpetually gray sky, out of the dense black pines that clawed at the clouds, and up from the very mud that tried to suck the boots off your feet with every miserable step. We were part of General Bradley's push, but it felt more like we were being fed inch by inch into a meat grinder made of trees and steel. We'd been bleeding in this patch of Germany for 3 weeks, and the forest had already eaten half our company. The replacements they sent up were getting younger, greener, and more terrified with every batch. Then we got him Private Samuel Washington. He arrived on the back of a deuce and a half, hopping down into the ankle-deep sludge. He stood there in a clean uniform, the wool still smelling of mothballs and stateside warehouses, looking like he'd taken a wrong turn on his way to a church picnic. The creases in his trousers were still sharp. It was obscene. My name is Sergeant Walter Harris. They call me Shadow because I've got a knack for staying alive where other men die. And my first thought on seeing this kid was that he was a ghost already, just too dumb to lie down and let the earth take him. He couldn't have been more than 19, a tall, skinny boy from somewhere deep in Georgia, with hands that looked like they were made for picking cotton or holding a prayer book, not for killing the other guys in the squad. What was left of them barely gave him a look. Men like Corporal King Davis from Chicago, a man built like a brick wall who'd lost 2 brothers at Anzio, and Old Blues Johnson from St. Louis, who could sleep through an artillery barrage but wake up if a twig snapped 50 yards away, had seen a dozen kids like him come and go. A new face was just a reminder of the one that used to be there, the one that got turned into red mist by a mortar shell last Tuesday. I walked over, my boots making a sick sucking sound in the mud. I looked him up and down. His gear was all wrong. Canteen bouncing on his hip, ammo belt too loose, helmet liner not properly seated. He looked like a kid playing dress-up. "Washington, you ever been shot at before?" I asked, my voice as rough as gravel. He shook his head, his Adam's apple bobbing. "No, Sergeant." I grunted, a sound of pure disgust. "You will be don't freeze, don't pray, don't think about your mama, you shoot back. You understand?" He nodded, but his eyes were a million miles away, probably back on some dusty porch swing. I tapped the stock of his M1 Garand, which he held across his chest like a holy relic he was afraid to scratch. "This here is the only thing that loves you now. You drop it, you die. You let it jam, you die. You forget to clean it, you die. You treat it better than you treat yourself." Just then, a shell from one of our own 105mm batteries whistled overhead. A friendly mail delivery heading east. The kid flinched so hard he stumbled backward, his new helmet slipping over his eyes. In his panic to right himself, he fumbled his rifle. It slipped from his grasp and clattered into the mud with a wet thud. The ultimate sin. King let out a short, bitter laugh from his foxhole. "Shadow, looks like you got a real soldier here." My jaw tightened until my teeth ached. It was worse than I thought. The boy's face burned with shame as he scrambled to pick up the mud-caked Garand. He was going to get us all killed. Later that day, the Krauts decided to welcome him properly. It wasn't a real attack, just their routine afternoon mail call with 88s, precise and deadly. The first shell shrieked in, a sound like tearing fabric, and the world exploded in mud and splintered wood about 50 yards away. Everyone who'd been here more than a day was already flat on their face in a ditch or a foxhole, part of the earth. I glanced over and saw Washington, standing bolt upright, frozen solid like a scarecrow in a cornfield. His face was pale, his mouth hanging open. He wasn't even breathing. Damn it. He was going to be one of those. The ones who buy it from pure, stupid fear. Another shell screamed closer. I cursed, scrambled out of my hole, and tackled him, driving him down into the muck just as the shell landed where he'd been standing. The concussion hammered my ears, and hot shrapnel hissed through the air above us. I shoved his face into the dirt, the smell of cordite and wet earth filling my nostrils. "Move! Move or you're dead!" I yelled, dragging him by the collar of his jacket toward my foxhole. He was like a dead weight, all limbs and terror. I threw him in first and jumped in after him, the hole barely big enough for 2. He just lay there at the bottom, curled into a ball, shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, his eyes shut tight and muttering something that might have been a prayer. He was useless, a liability, a two-legged death sentence for anyone who had the bad luck to be near him. When the shelling finally stopped, I pushed him out of the hole with my boot. "Dig," I ordered, pointing at a patch of ground. "Dig your own grave, because you sure as hell won't last long enough to need another one." He spent the next hour clumsily hacking at the root-choked earth with his entrenching tool, making a hole a dog would be ashamed of. That evening I saw him sitting apart from the others, carefully reading a letter from home, his face illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the shattered canopy. He was in another world, a world that had no place here. He was a burden, plain and simple. And in the Hürtgen Forest, burdens get left behind, one way or another. 2 days passed in a miserable crawl of rain, patrols, and the constant gnawing tension that lived in your gut like a parasite. Washington kept to himself, cleaning his rifle with a meticulous care that bordered on obsession, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He was still jumpy, flinching at every snapped twig or distant rumble, but he hadn't frozen again. He was just a quiet, useless presence, another mouth to feed, another body to count. I assigned him the worst details: digging latrines in the rocky soil, hauling ammo crates until his skinny arms shook, and taking the last watch when the cold was at its most bitter. I wanted to break him or make him quit. I didn't care which. The greenhorn lieutenant, fresh out of OCS and still believing the maps he carried, called the squad leaders to his command post, a glorified hole covered with a leaky poncho. His name was Peters, a soft-faced kid from Ohio, who probably thought Stalingrad was a brand of vodka. He pointed a shaky finger at a contour line on his map. "Sergeant, intelligence says there's a crowd observation post on this ridge here. Calls down mortar fire on the whole valley. We're scheduled for a push tomorrow morning, and Division wants that OP neutralized. Your squad will lead the assault." I looked at the map. The ridge was a nasty piece of real estate, a spine of rock and pine that the Germans had held for a month. Taking it would be a frontal assault into machine guns, a suicide run. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice flat, "my squad's under strength. We go up that hill head on, the only thing we'll neutralize is ourselves." Peter's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned. "Your orders are to take that ridge, Sergeant." I looked at my men huddled under the dripping trees. King, Blues, and the handful of others left. Good men, tired men. I wasn't going to throw their lives away for a lieutenant's ambition. Then I saw him, Washington. He was standing slightly apart, trying to make himself small, his eyes fixed on the ground as if he could will himself to disappear. An idea, cold and cruel, slid into my mind. It was the perfect solution. A way to follow the letter of the order while saving my real soldiers. A way to finally be rid of the burden. I walked back to the squad, the men's eyes on me, waiting for the bad news. I ignored them and strode right up to Washington. He flinched as I stopped in front of him. "Private," I said, my voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "you see that ridge over there?" I pointed into the gloom, where the jagged line of the hill was barely visible against the bruised sky. "I need eyes up there. I need to know exactly what we're walking into." The kid stared at the ridge, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. He knew what it was. Everyone knew. They called it the Widowmaker. I unhooked a field telephone from my belt and shoved it into his chest, along with a heavy spool of commo wire. "Your new job. You're going to take this, and you're going to crawl up there. You find a spot where you can see their positions. You unspool this wire all the way back, and you call me and tell me what you see. You do not get seen. You do not fire your weapon unless a kraut is standing on your goddamn head. You are a ghost. Got it?" The other men were dead silent. King shot me a look, a mixture of disbelief and disgust. Even Blues shook his head slowly. They knew what this was. I was sending the kid on a one-way trip. It was a hazing and an execution rolled into one. No one expected him to make it 100 yards, let alone up that ridge. To his credit, Washington didn't argue. He just stood there for a second, his thin chest rising and falling, and then gave a short, jerky nod. "Yes, Sergeant." He took the equipment, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the straps. He looked at me one last time, his eyes full of a fear so deep it was almost black, but there was something else in there too. a flicker of grim acceptance. Then he turned and melted into the woods, the spool of wire unwinding behind him like a thin, dark trail of hope he was leaving behind. I watched him go until the forest swallowed him whole. I didn't expect to ever see him again. I turned to the rest of the squad. "All right," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Forget the goddamn ridge. That was for the lieutenant's ears. The real plan is this. We're swinging west. We're going to follow this creek bed and hit the supply trail behind their main line at dawn. Leave the OP for the flyboys to handle." King spat on the ground, but he nodded. This was a plan that made sense. This was a plan that might keep us alive. The kid on the hill was already a memory, a necessary sacrifice. This war wasn't for boys who read letters and fumbled their rifles. It was for men who knew how to survive. And I had just cut the deadweight loose. The creek bed was a smart move, a goddamn brilliant move, I told myself. It was a scar in the earth, deep enough to hide a standing man in most places, and the rushing water covered the sound of our movement. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds our own breathing and the water churning over slick black stones. The men were tense but focused. This felt right. It was a soldier's problem, solved a soldier's way, not some officer's fantasy drawn on a map. A cold sliver of confidence began to thaw the dread in my stomach. We were almost out of the thickest woods, nearing the German supply trail. I could already taste the stolen schnapps. And then I saw it. A piece of tripwire, thin and dark, stretched just above the waterline, almost invisible, against a fallen log. I opened my mouth to yell, but it was too late. Someone up front snagged it. There was no explosion, just a single rusty cowbell that let out a pathetic clank. It was a doorbell to hell. Before the sound died, the world ripped itself in half. From a fortified bunker built into the hillside to our right, a position we hadn't seen, couldn't have seen, an MG-42 opened up. Hitler's buzzsaw. It's a sound you never forget. A solid, tearing noise, like a giant ripping a canvas sheet the size of the sky. It fired so fast, the individual shots blurred into one continuous shriek. The stream beside us exploded in 1,000 tiny geysers as the first burst chewed through the water. "Down! Right flank!" I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the chaos. Blues, who was just ahead of me, grunted and pitched forward into the water, a dark cloud spreading around him in the current. He was gone before he hit the rocks. The creek bed, our brilliant cover, had become a perfect killing jar. The Krauts had the angles. They'd known we'd come this way. The whole thing, the undefended supply trail, the quiet woods, had been bait. Panic started to set in. Men were firing wildly at a bunker they could barely see, their grand pings sounding like toys against the MG-42's roar. Then came the mortars. The thump, thump, thump of the tubes was followed a few seconds later by explosions that walked right down the length of our position. Mud, water, and body parts flew into the air. I saw our medic, a good kid from Alabama, get torn in half by a direct hit. Our radio operator was trying to get a signal out, huddled behind a boulder, when a single rifle shot from the trees above drilled him clean through his helmet. The radio, our only link to anything, tumbled into the stream and was gone. We were alone. Completely and utterly alone. I risked a look over the bank. Up on the main road, where the official attack was supposed to have been, I saw our supporting Sherman tank trying to advance. It fired its 75mm once, a useless puff of smoke against the hillside, before a Panzerfaust team got it. There was a bright flash, a plume of oily black smoke, and then the terrible sound of ammunition cooking off inside. So much for support. Much for... We were pinned, bleeding out, and being systematically dismantled. The Germans weren't rushing us. They were professionals. They had us in a box and were just taking their time, picking us off one by one. King was beside me, firing his bar in short, controlled bursts to conserve ammo, his face a mask of grim fury. "It's a goddamn slaughterhouse, Sarge," he yelled over the din. He was right. I had led them here. My brilliant plan. My attempt to sidestep the lieutenant's suicide order had led us into an even more perfect trap. The thought of the kid, Washington, on the ridge never even crossed my mind. He was a ghost, a non-entity, a problem I had solved hours ago by sending him off to die alone. He didn't matter. All that mattered was the ripping death of the machine gun, the screams of my men, and the cold, hard fact that I had failed them. The mortars stopped. A new sound began, the clack of German stick grenades hitting trees and rolling down the bank toward us. They were getting ready for the final push. I checked my ammunition. 2 clips. King had 1 bar magazine left. It was over. We were already dead men. The Germans were just making it official. The end has a certain sound. It's not the screaming of the dying or the roar of explosions. It's the quiet click of a rifle bolt closing on an empty chamber. It's the finality in a man's eyes when he knows he's fired his last shot. That's where we were. I had 1 clip left for my grand. King was down to his last few rounds for the bar. The German stick grenades were landing closer now, their explosions muffled by the wet earth, each one a countdown timer. Across the creek, I could see gray uniformed figures massing behind the trees, getting ready to charge across and finish the job. There was nothing left to do but stand up and take as many of them with us as we could. A grim acceptance settled over me. This was it. A shitty end in a shitty forest, for a cause I'd long since stopped trying to understand. I gave King a nod. He nodded back, his face streaked with mud and blood, but his eyes were steady. We were going to die like soldiers. Just as the first wave of German infantry started to rise from their positions, a sound cut through the noise of the battle, a sound so out of place it was like a church bell ringing in hell. It was the sharp, distinctive crack of a single M1 Garand, and it didn't come from our position. It came from high above us, from the German rear, from somewhere on the ridge we were supposed to have assaulted. The German NCO leading the charge, a big man with a mustache and an MP40, stiffened, a neat dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. The other Germans froze, looking around in confusion. They dropped back into cover, shouting at each other, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. My first thought was that it was a miracle, that another company had come up behind them. But that was impossible. We were miles ahead of the main line, and our radio was at the bottom of the creek. Then another shot rang out. Another German, one trying to crawl to a new position, jerked and lay still. The shots were slow, deliberate, patient. This wasn't a squad laying down suppressing fire. This was a hunter, a ghost in the trees picking them off one by one. The Germans, who had been the confident executioners just moments before, were now panicked prey. They started firing wildly into the woods behind them, their bullets zipping uselessly through the pines. The MG-42, which had started firing again, suddenly swiveled around, away from us, and began hosing down the ridge, its tracer rounds a frantic red line, stitching through the dark trees. They were terrified. They were being hit from the one place they thought was safe. I watched, stunned into silence. Who the hell was up there? A grenade, an American pineapple, sailed in a high arc from the ridge and landed with impossible precision right in the middle of the MG-42 nest. The explosion was followed by screams, and the buzzsaw went silent for good. That's when the chaos truly broke loose. The disciplined German unit dissolved into a terrified mob. They had no idea who was up there or how many of them there were. Was it a platoon? A company? Their officers were screaming orders that nobody was following. They were caught between us down in the creek and the phantom on the high ground. I saw my chance. "They're spooked. Pour it on," I yelled to my men. It wasn't about killing them anymore. It was about making them think we were stronger than we were. We used our last precious rounds, firing at the flashes from their muzzles, adding to the confusion. King propped his bar on the bank and let loose a final, defiant burst that made 3 Germans dive for cover. He was grinning like a madman. Hope, an emotion I thought I'd buried weeks ago, was a wild, intoxicating thing. It surged through me, sharp and painful. We weren't dead yet. The ghost on the ridge had given us a chance. A single rifle, firing with cold, methodical purpose, had broken their attack and thrown their entire line into disarray. King crawled over to me, his eyes wide. Sarge, who is that? Who in God's name is up there? I shook my head, my mind refusing to form the impossible thought. I don't know, King, I said, my voice a hoarse whisper. But he's buying us time. Let's not waste it. The ghost on the ridge had given us a ghost of a chance, nothing more. The German infantry was in disarray, but they weren't broken. And then we heard it, a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the mud and into the bones of my feet. The sound of heavy machinery. From behind the chaos, crawling up the supply trail with an arrogant slowness, came the real threat. A Panzer. Its long 75mm cannon swung back and forth, a predator sniffing the air. The rifle fire from the ridge stopped. A single man with a Garand, no matter how good, was just a mosquito to this iron beast. The handful of us left in the creek bed were nothing, a nuisance to be erased. The tank ignored the scattered infantry and turned its attention to us, its steel treads churning the earth, crushing the body of one of our fallen men with an indifferent crunch. This was the checkmate. The trap had a final, unanswerable move. I watched the Panzer crawl closer, its machine gun spitting short, probing bursts into the bank above our heads. There was nowhere to run. King was beside me, his bar empty, his face a mask of weary resignation. This was a death you couldn't fight. It was too big, too loud, too final. The tank lumbered to a halt, not 40 yards from us, preparing to fire a high-explosive shell that would turn our little pocket of resistance into a crater of red mud. I closed my eyes, a flash of my wife's face. A dusty road back home, the things you see in the last second. I waited for the world to end. Instead, I heard a dull thump. Not the cannon blast. Something else. Something small and heavy, landing on metal. I opened my eyes. On the rear engine deck of the Panzer, right over the air intake vents, sat a small, tightly wrapped bundle of grenades, held together with commo wire. My commo wire. The explosion was not dramatic. It was a contained, angry crack that blew the engine grill a dozen feet into the air. A geyser of thick black smoke erupted from the tank's rear, followed by angry orange flames. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was a fatal wound. The tank was blinded and choking on its own smoke. A moment later, the turret hatch flew open and a German commander in a black uniform tried to scramble out, his face a mask of panic. Before he was halfway out, the sharp crack of the Garand echoed from the ridge one last time, and the commander slumped back down into his fiery tomb. The side hatches burst open, and the rest of the crew bailed out, only to be cut down by a furious, final burst from King's bar. He had found one last magazine, and then there was silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the crackle of the burning tank. The surviving German infantry, seeing their armor burning and their officers dead, had melted back into the forest. It was over. We lay there for a long time, not moving, not quite believing we were still breathing. Then, from a ditch on the far side of the supply trail, a figure rose. He was covered in mud from head to toe, his uniform was torn, and a dark line of blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. He held his M1 Garand at the low ready, its woodstock scarred and splintered. It was Washington. He wasn't a boy anymore. The fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by an exhaustion so complete it looked like a kind of peace. He methodically reloaded his rifle with a final ping of an ejected clip, his movements sure and steady, before he started walking toward us, limping slightly. The few of us who were left just watched him come. No one spoke. We watched this kid, this burden I had sent off to die, walk back from the dead through the carnage he had single-handedly stopped. He slid down the bank into our position, his eyes scanning our faces, counting the living, counting the dead. He stopped in front of me. For a moment, we just looked at each other. He was no longer the frightened rookie. He was a soldier, baptized in fire and blood in a way I had never seen. He straightened up, what little energy he had left pulling him into a semblance of military bearing. "The ridge is clear, Sergeant," he said, his voice raspy and low. "There was a machine gun nest and a mortar team. I ran into a little trouble, but I took care of it. A little trouble. My mind reeled. He had crawled through enemy lines, alone, with nothing but a rifle and a spool of wire. He had dismantled an entire defensive position, saved us from a charge, and then crippled a tank. He had done the impossible. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. Thank you. I'm sorry. You're a hero. They all sounded cheap, hollow. He had proven something that words couldn't touch. So I just stood there, looking at this boy who had become a man, and I gave him a short, sharp nod. Later that night, as we waited for the rest of the company to find us, I found him sitting by himself, cleaning his rifle. I walked over and sat down beside him in the dirt. I didn't say a word. I just pulled the metal flask from my jacket, unscrewed the cap, and held it out to him. He looked at the flask and then at me, and his eyes understood everything. He took it, and the gesture said more than I ever could.